On June 6, 2017, a British couple were staying at a remote holiday cottage in the small Danish town of Nørre Nebel, 3 days into a trip they were due to fly home from that very evening. That morning, the husband told emergency services he had woken up to find his wife face down in the cottage's swimming pool, fully clothed, and that he had struggled to pull her out. By the time paramedics reached her, it was already too late to save her, and there was nothing more anyone could do. She was pronounced dead a short time later. She was 47 years old, an heiress to a successful family business back in Greater Manchester, a healthy woman who could swim, standing 5'5" tall, in a pool that was less than 4 feet deep. Danish police initially treated her death as a tragic accident. It would take a financial audit conducted an ocean away, a will with a forged signature, and 7 years of overlapping criminal and civil court proceedings before anyone could say, with real confidence, what actually happened to Paula Leeson in that pool. Before we get into it, if you're one of the more than 90% of viewers on this channel who haven't hit subscribe yet, go ahead and do that now, along with dropping a like on this video. And if you'd like us to look into true crime cases from your own part of the world, let us know in the comments below. We read every single one, and it genuinely helps shape what we cover next. Now let's go back to the beginning, to understand exactly who Paula Leeson was, and who the man she married actually turned out to be, because the gap between those two things is really what this entire case comes down to. Paula Leeson was born on May 29, 1970, and grew up in Sale, in Greater Manchester, as part of a close, hard-working family. Her father, Willie Leeson, had emigrated from County Wicklow, Ireland, in the 1960s, and built up a successful groundworking, recycling, and skip-hire business, W. Leeson and Son, from the ground up. Paula worked in that family business, handling phones and taking orders, and by every account she was both a conscientious employee and a devoted, loving mother to her son, Ben, who lived with Paula's parents, Willie and Betty, at the family home in Sale. Paula stood to inherit a share of that business alongside her brother, Neville, who had a partner, Emma, and a young daughter of their own. Family members would later describe the Leesons as an unusually close-knit unit, the kind of family that worked together, socialized together, and looked out for one another. Paula herself was described by those who knew her as hardworking and frugal, someone who took her responsibilities, both at the family business and as a mother, seriously. She was, by any reasonable description, a woman with a stable, comfortable life built around family, not the profile of someone anyone would expect to die under suspicious circumstances on a foreign holiday. That changed after what friends and family would later describe as a whirlwind romance with a man named Donald McPherson. He told the Leesons he was a property developer, financially successful, well-traveled, and instantly likable, the kind of man who seemed to fit effortlessly into a warm, established family like theirs. The two of them married in 2014, at a lavish, no-expense-spared ceremony held at a castle in Cheshire, the kind of wedding that left a lasting impression on everyone who attended. Paula's friend Lynn Dale served as maid of honor that day, and would later describe it as one of the happiest days she'd witnessed her friend experience. What none of the Leesons knew at the time, and what would only fully come to light years later, during extensive civil litigation after Paula's death, was that almost nothing McPherson had told them about himself was true. His real name was not Donald McPherson at all. He had been born Alexander James Lang, in New Zealand, and had grown up there with his parents and 2 sisters, a completely ordinary upbringing, nothing like the story he told the Leesons about having grown up in foster care. He'd left home at 19, studied at the University of Auckland, and eventually moved to the United Kingdom in 1995. Over the years that followed, he changed his name multiple times, adopting new identities as it apparently suited him. By the time he met Paula, he was, in reality, a convicted fraudster with 32 separate criminal convictions spanning 15 years across 3 different countries, including involvement in a fraud scheme worth close to £12 million. Later court proceedings would describe him as a Walter Mitty type figure, a reference to the famous fictional character known for compulsively fabricating a more impressive version of his own life. He had been married once before Paula, and during that marriage, while McPherson himself was in prison in Germany, his wife and their child died in a house fire, a devastating tragedy that, whatever its actual circumstances, McPherson would later fold into yet another version of his own personal history. None of this history was known to the Leeson family when Paula married him in 2014. What they experienced instead was a man who appeared successful, charming, and deeply devoted to Paula. Behind that image, according to what would later emerge in court, McPherson's financial situation was in serious trouble, and he had already begun taking steps to profit from Paula's death, years before it actually happened. According to evidence later presented in civil court, McPherson began securing life insurance policies on Paula's life even before the two of them were officially married, entirely without her knowledge. Over time, he built up a portfolio of at least 7 separate secret life insurance policies on her, worth a combined total of roughly £3.5 million, a staggering sum relative to what most couples would ever consider reasonable coverage. He structured some of these policies as joint life insurance, positioning himself as trustee over the payouts, which gave him direct legal control of the proceeds regardless of what Paula herself might have wanted. He also, according to a later court ruling, forged the signature of one of the witnesses on a will purportedly signed by Paula in 2014, a forgery that would ultimately render that entire will legally invalid, and which, crucially, named McPherson as her sole beneficiary rather than her son or the rest of her family. Paula, by every indication, remained completely unaware of any of it. By June of 2017, McPherson was carrying significant personal debt, reported to be around £67,000, a financial pressure that, according to what prosecutors would later argue, gave him a very real and pressing reason to want access to the millions of pounds in coverage he had already quietly secured. That same month, he booked a holiday for himself and Paula at a remote cottage in Nørre Nebel, a small, sparsely populated town on the western coast of Denmark, a location isolated enough that there would be no witnesses nearby, no neighbors close enough to hear anything unusual. The two of them arrived on June 3rd, with plans to fly home just 3 days later. On the morning of June 6th, they were due to leave for the airport. Instead, emergency services were called to the cottage, where McPherson told them he'd woken up to find Paula face down in the property's shallow outdoor swimming pool. Danish police who responded that day and in the days that followed initially concluded that Paula's death was, in their words, assumed accidental. There was little at the scene, on the surface, to suggest otherwise: an unfamiliar remote holiday property, an unfortunate slip, a tragic drowning far from home. It was the kind of death that, in an isolated foreign location with no other witnesses present, could easily have been filed away and forgotten entirely, another sad statistic from a holiday gone wrong. Danish investigators would later revise that initial finding to undetermined, but for a period of time, Paula Leeson's death was treated as exactly what it appeared to be: a terrible accident on holiday. Back in England, however, a very different picture was starting to take shape, not from anything found at the Danish crime scene, but from Paula's own bank accounts. According to evidence later presented at trial, McPherson began transferring thousands of pounds out of Paula's accounts within hours of her death, using the money to pay down his own debts, a remarkably fast turnaround for a man supposedly still processing the sudden loss of his wife. He soon cleared their shared home and sale of Paula's belongings, removing photographs, clothing, and personal items in a matter of weeks. And within months of losing his wife, McPherson joined a bereavement support group for young widows and widowers called Widowed and Young, which he privately described to at least one friend as being like, in his own words, Tinder for widows. A comment that would later strike prosecutors and jurors as remarkably callous for a man supposedly grieving his own murdered spouse. That same friend, a man named Joseph Ennis-Cole who had met McPherson at a flying school, later testified that McPherson never once told him Paula had drowned. Instead, McPherson told him she had died in her sleep, and separately claimed she'd had an allergic reaction to medication, two entirely different, entirely false explanations for the death of the woman he'd been married to for 3 years. It was Greater Manchester Police, working through McPherson's finances as part of a routine background review connected to his wife's death overseas, who first uncovered the scale of what he'd actually set up. The secret insurance policies worth millions of pounds, the forged will naming him sole beneficiary, and a financial motive that had apparently been building for years before Paula ever set foot in Denmark. What began as a standard procedural check into a British citizen who had died abroad quickly turned into something far more serious, as investigators realized just how much money stood to flow directly to McPherson as a result of his wife's death. McPherson was arrested in the United Kingdom and ultimately charged with her murder. A more detailed picture of Paula's final moments also began to emerge through forensic evidence. A routine post-mortem examination in Denmark had to be halted after examiners discovered internal bleeding in Paula's neck, a finding significant enough to change the entire trajectory of the investigation. Investigators ultimately documented 13 separate injuries across her head and body. Professor Peter Leth, a forensic pathologist who examined the case, testified that while he couldn't rule out that another person had caused her injuries, the pattern of those injuries didn't necessarily indicate she'd been involved in a violent struggle before entering the pool. He explained that it was entirely possible to drown someone without much of a fight at all, if the person doing it was heavier than the victim and the victim was caught by surprise, a scenario that, he said, wouldn't necessarily leave behind obvious marks of violence. Notably, Danish police had initially, and incorrectly, told Professor Leth that Paula was a non-swimmer, information that would have shaped his early analysis before it was later corrected. Paula's friend Lindale offered the jury something else entirely: her own first-hand knowledge of who Paula actually was, built over years of genuine friendship rather than forensic analysis. She testified that Paula would never willingly go into a swimming pool, that she disliked swimming, disliked getting wet, and would not even go near water if she could help it, a detail that, on its own, did little to prove murder, but that sat uneasily alongside the official story of an accidental late-night dip that ended in tragedy. It was the kind of small, human detail that no forensic report could capture, the sort of thing only someone who actually knew Paula Leeson would think to mention. McPherson's trial for Paula's murder began at Manchester Crown Court in 2021. Prosecutors described what they believed had happened as a sinister, pre-planned killing, one they argued McPherson had begun preparing for almost from the moment he and Paula first met, pointing to those years of secretly accumulated life insurance policies as proof of long-term premeditation. Jurors heard about the Tinder for widows comment, about the money moved out of Paula's accounts within hours of her death, about the forged will, and about McPherson's shifting, inconsistent stories to friends about how his wife had actually died. The defense, led by John Ryder, pushed back hard against the forensic conclusions, suggesting Paula's injuries could just as easily be explained by an accidental fall into the pool, or even a sudden fainting spell, followed by desperate, clumsy attempts to pull her out and revive her, attempts that could account for bruising without requiring any violence at all. Under cross-examination, Professor Leth agreed he could not entirely rule out the possibility that Paula had simply fainted and fallen into the water on her own. Partway through the trial, the presiding judge, Mr. Justice Goose, ruled on a defense submission arguing there was no case for McPherson to answer. The judge agreed, finding that while there was substantial circumstantial evidence pointing toward McPherson's financial motive, the prosecution had not presented sufficient evidence to prove, to the required criminal standard of beyond reasonable doubt, the precise physical mechanism by which Paula had drowned. On the judge's direction, the jury formally returned a verdict of not guilty. Donald McPherson walked out of Manchester Crown Court in 2021 a free man, cleared of his wife's murder. For Paula's family, that acquittal was not the end of the story. Her son, Ben Leeson, and her elderly father, Willie Leeson, pursued an entirely separate legal path, filing civil proceedings against McPherson at the Manchester Civil Justice Centre, refusing to accept that a criminal acquittal was the final word on how Paula had actually died. Their goal was straightforward but significant: to have a judge formally rule, under the civil burden of proof, the lower standard of the balance of probabilities rather than the criminal standard of beyond reasonable doubt, that McPherson had unlawfully killed Paula. If successful, that finding would trigger what's known in English law as the forfeiture rule, permanently blocking McPherson from inheriting anything from Paula's estate, from their jointly held property, or from the very insurance policies he'd secretly taken out on her life. The family also asked the court to formally declare Paula's 2014 will invalid due to the forged witness signature, and to remove McPherson as trustee of the remaining insurance policies still connected to Paula's name. The civil trial took place over several weeks in the spring of 2024, running from mid-April into early May. The court heard from 18 witnesses of fact and 4 expert witnesses, examining not just the circumstances of Paula's death, but the entire architecture of McPherson's financial dealings, including the specific insurance policies, the trust arrangements he had quietly established, and the forged will itself. Donald McPherson himself did not attend, and was not legally represented, telling the court he was living and working somewhere in the South Pacific and would be unable to appear. The judge found that McPherson had deliberately chosen to absent himself from the proceedings rather than face the evidence against him directly, and allowed the trial to continue in his absence. It was during this civil trial that McPherson's true background, his real name, his New Zealand upbringing, his fabricated stories about foster care, and the full extent of his decades-long pattern of fraud across 3 countries, was laid out in complete detail for the first time, information the Leeson family said they had never had access to during the original criminal proceedings years earlier. In September of 2024, Mr. Justice Richard Smith delivered his ruling. Weighing all the evidence presented, including the pathology findings, financial records, and witness testimony, he concluded, without hesitation, that Donald McPherson had deliberately and unlawfully killed Paula Leeson in Denmark, by compressing her neck in an arm lock to render her unconscious, and then placing her body into the pool so that she would drown. Based on that finding, the court blocked McPherson from inheriting any portion of Paula's £4.4 million estate. The judge ruled her 2014 will invalid because of the forged signature, meaning Paula had legally died without a valid will at all, and appointed her son, Ben, as the official representative of her estate. McPherson was also formally removed as trustee of the remaining life insurance policies still tied to Paula's name, worth close to another £3 million in combined coverage on their own, control that passed instead to Ben and Willie. For a family that had spent years watching McPherson benefit financially from Paula's death, first through the accounts he emptied within hours of her passing, and later through years of legal maneuvering to protect his claim to her estate, the ruling represented the first real financial consequence he had faced since 2017. McPherson had already left the United Kingdom in 2022, well ahead of the civil trial, and was believed by that point to be living somewhere in the South Pacific, possibly New Zealand, the country of his birth and the place where his entire fabricated identity had first begun to take shape decades earlier. In 2025, he was separately convicted in absentia of contempt of court, for failing to properly disclose his financial assets during the civil proceedings against him, and was sentenced to 2 years in prison, a sentence he has not served, given that his whereabouts remain unclear. The final word on Paula Leeson's case came from a coroner's inquest, delayed for years by the overlapping criminal trial and civil litigation, and finally held at Stockport Coroner's Court. Manchester's senior coroner, Alison Much, reviewed the full civil court findings and reached her own formal conclusion, one that carried its own independent legal weight even after the High Court's ruling had already been issued. She stated plainly that Paula's death occurred because her husband compressed her neck to render her unconscious, causing her body to enter the pool, and that she drowned, so that McPherson could financially benefit from her death. Her death, the coroner concluded, was the result of an unlawful killing. "I am therefore satisfied," she told the court. "He did murder his wife." Donald McPherson has never faced a criminal conviction for Paula Leeson's death. Under English law, his 2021 acquittal at Manchester Crown Court stands, and double jeopardy protections mean he cannot be tried again for her murder based on the same evidence, regardless of what any later civil court or coroner might conclude. What exists instead is a stack of formal legal findings, a High Court civil ruling, and now a coroner's own conclusion, all reaching the same result through different legal standards and different courtrooms, years apart, while the one person at the center of it all remains somewhere outside the country, beyond the reach of the sentence a jury never got the chance to hand down. What makes this case so difficult to sit with isn't just the years of secret insurance policies, or the forged signature on a dead woman's will, or even the sheer scale of Donald McPherson's decades of fabricated identities. It's the fact that a criminal jury and a high court judge, working from an overlapping but not identical body of evidence, reached completely different formal conclusions about the exact same act. One system, held to the highest possible burden of proof, found there wasn't quite enough to be certain. Another, applying a different legal standard years later, found there was more than enough to be sure. Paula Leeson's family spent 7 years moving between those two systems, chasing an official acknowledgement of what they already believed had happened to her from the very beginning. It's also worth sitting with just how long this entire process actually took. Paula died in the summer of 2017. Her husband wasn't formally acquitted until 2021, 4 years later. The civil trial that ultimately found him responsible didn't take place until the spring of 2024, 7 years after her death, and the coroner's own formal conclusion, agreeing with that finding, only arrived after that, delayed for years by the sheer weight of overlapping legal proceedings. Throughout nearly the entire span of that time, Donald McPherson remained a free man, financially maneuvering, forming new relationships through a widow's support group less than a year after Paula's death, and eventually relocating to the other side of the world before the final reckoning ever caught up with him. Paula's father, Willie, in his 80s by the time the civil case concluded, spent those years fighting not just for a legal outcome, but simply for official recognition that his daughter had not died by accident at all. If this case stayed with you, do us a favor and hit subscribe, drop a like on this video, and share it with someone who appreciates true crime told carefully and honestly. Paula Leeson's story is a reminder that justice doesn't always arrive on a single, clean timeline, and sometimes takes far longer, and far more courtrooms, than anyone would ever want it to, but that persistence, in the end, can still get there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.